Hello, and welcome to the Musella Foundation's Brain Tumor Awareness Month webinar series. We're kicking off the series tonight with Unsha Bakker, a nurse navigator for the Brain Cancer Support and Solutions Alliance, also known as the BCSSA. The BCSSA is a collaborative partnership supported by Head for the Cure, the Musella Foundation, and Cancer Commons in order to provide support, education, and guidance to brain cancer patients and their families. For everyone watching live, there will be a Q&A after the presentation, so please feel free to type your questions into the chat. Unsha, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. So happy to be here today, and thank you all for your time today. So my name is Unsha, and I'm truly honored to serve as a nurse navigator here for the Brain Cancer Support and Solutions Alliance. And here at Cancer Commons as well. And this role was really made possible through the generous support of the BCSSA member organizations, including Head for the Cure Foundation and the Musella Foundation for brain tumor research and information. And so today I really just want to talk about clinical trials and just some key factors and information about them. And I really want you all to be able to walk away with just some empowerment and some information to really help you through this process and just not help to just not make you feel alone and just less isolated through this process in finding treatment options and just more information that I know can, often be overwhelming when it's just all included in the, you know, wide web and just through institutions and so many other platforms. So I wanted to start off by talking about, why clinical trials matter, and then we'll go into, what they really entail. So clinical trials are essential to advancing medical knowledge, improving patient care. They oftentimes test new therapies and combinations and approaches in order to determine if these treatments are safe, effective, or even better than current and existing treatments or models. For patients, they can often also provide access to cutting edge treatments that are not yet widely available and improve accessibility in that way. So a big question that I get is what are the phases of clinical trials? And I think it's very important to really know about the different phases of clinical trials and really, how they can impact patients when they're deciding on what trial to go for in terms of, is it a phase 1, 2, 3, and oftentimes 4. So with phase 1 trials, they're really determining about safety first. So it typically ends up being a small group of patients. This is just an estimate of how many patients. So typically, let's say 10 to 50 patients. It's often the first time that the treatment is being tested in humans. They're testing dosage, side effects, and how the drug behaves in the body. So in terms of maybe route of administration, if that's oral, IV, intradermal, they're trying to compare that and see. And each new cohort can receive a higher dose until the optimal dosing is found as well. So they're in that way balancing safety with potential benefit before advancing it to the next phase, which would bring us to phase 2. They're still looking at safety. However, now it's a larger group. So now we're looking at efficacy. So it can be anywhere from 50 to 100 patients. Again, this can be an estimate. They're seeing, is this treatment actually helping people now in a different way? So, are the tumors shrinking? Is there slowing of the growth? Is it helping symptoms? And this can often be the first time that people can also receive medications with a specific type of cancer. So, does drug A help disease B? And when we're looking at phase 3 trials, they can compare it to the standard treatment. So now we're looking at even larger populations, anywhere from the hundreds to thousands. They can compare the new treatment to the current standard of care. Is this better? Is this the same? Is this worse than what's already, on the market and what patients have been using for, specific disease types? And then it's used to determine if it should be approved for further widespread use. When we're looking at phase 4, which is post-market surveillance, this is conducted after FDA approval. It's helping monitor long-term effectiveness or, rare side effects that might have not shown up in the initial trials. And we're really looking at real-world effectiveness. And, how does this treatment work in the everyday life? So why I really like highlighting this is because as a patient, I think it's very important to know, what exact phase are you looking at when you're looking at trials and how that can really impact your needs, your quality of life, and your preferences as well. There can also be further caveats to clinical trials, including blinded trials or open label trials. So with blinded trials, oftentimes participants or the researchers or physicians don't know which treatment is being given. So this is, the patient doesn't know, and whoever's conducting the study also doesn't know. This really helps in preventing bias in reporting results. And in terms of open label trials, both patients and the physicians will know what treatment is being given. And, this can be common when they're also comparing known treatments in later phase trials. And again, this is also important to know, for your patient preference as well. Maybe you're not comfortable being in a blinded study or you are okay with it. I think it's very important to just have that information and, see as much as you can know prior to enrolling. Then there's also placebo versus non-placebo treatments. So with placebo-controlled trials, one group can receive the investigational treatment while another group receives an inactive treatment or substance. This really helps isolate the treatment effect. I placed an example here on the side with an experimental group and the placebo group when comparing Optune, TMZ, and Pembro, and then the other group only was getting Optune and TMZ, where the placebo was a saline solution. So when discussing placebo versus non-placebo, it can really pose a lot of challenges, especially ethically. In the name of science, I understand why this can happen and, why, again, we're trying to not create these biases in results. However, I do recognize it can be incredibly challenging to make that decision as a patient, especially when some patients often only have, one trial opportunity or, there aren't much options. So this really highlights a major limitation in trial design. And, my hope really is for the future that there are more advancements in science where, this doesn't have to be one of the only ways we can really see results, and especially in patient populations where they really might not have the time or capacity to really go through with the placebo trial. And in non-placebo, they can be comparing new treatment to standard of care. So for example, if we were using this example on the screen, perhaps they would be comparing the Optune and TMZ, and then the TMZ, Optune, and the Pembro. So here I just wanted to place some screenshots and just a little walkthrough of, what patients typically see if they are trying to navigate this space on their own. And let's say, you open up clinicaltrials.gov. So I have a QR code here that has tutorials with some screenshots with some of the information that I provided. And just for your reference, we'll also be having the links at the end in case you're not comfortable using the QR code. So I just wanted to kind of give an overview on what the website can look like. If you're familiar with it, if you're not, there can be a breakdown with the search terms, including condition or disease, other terms, interventions, and location. And, I'm going to go more into detail on this in a few slides. Then more eligibility criteria. And I really wanted to point out this slide right here because when you're looking at the criteria, it's important to just keep on going to the bottom of the page because there's more filters there. So if you click more filters, you can find, if you're looking for expanded access options, There's also other options such as recruiting or not actively recruiting. And so it's really important when you're trying to filter these things out to try to be as specific as you can. And I know that there's limitations as well in this search, but I wanted to at least provide an overview on what it looks like. And aside from just any screenshots or demos, this actually has some video resources if that's your learning preference as well. So there's quite a bit of different ways to just look through this. And then again, I included the QR link here, and we'll provide that link at the end as well. So when we're thinking about, how can we search and really narrow down these trials? And so there's can be, as I mentioned, different criteria and things that you can kind of help to narrow things down. So again, with tumor type, I just gave some examples of glioblastoma. If you want to put in DIPG, medulloblastoma, what is relevant to what you're searching, mutations or biomarkers and trials that you're already considering. So let's say you want to start a search and you're not sure where to begin, but your physician maybe had mentioned to you about some trials, or maybe you had heard of it from your own research and advocacy. You can also, take that as a reference and look that up as well so that you can kind of look into more detail with it and have more accurate information. And in terms of looking through this, we'll go into also about how to really figure out accuracy and what's active, but I also wanted to still talk about the other filters, which we mentioned about recruiting or not yet recruiting. I think, sometimes you're just clicking on a lot of different things and there's a lot of information there. So, oftentimes even when I've helped patients search, I'm like, wow, there's so many things here, and then ends up not being accurate. I'm like, oh, I didn't press uh, recruiting only, which hopefully can help us narrow down more active sites. You can include your city, state, and country for location. Typing in a full address can also allow you to have a search radius. So I believe it's within, a certain set of miles that you can also help narrow down. And when you're looking at this on the exact clinical trial page, you can see the sites, the names will be there, phone numbers, emails, and the location exactly of where it's supposed to be located. Let's say it's located in New York, it will say, New York, let's say NYU or Lenox Hill, wherever it may be, and that will be included there. And you can also choose the different phase of the trial, which I was mentioning. It's really important, if you know that, maybe you're not comfortable being on a phase 1 trial, then you can try to exclude that from your search so that every time you search, the phase 1 trials won't appear. Intervention type. I've spoken to a lot of different patients who maybe tell me, maybe I'm open to an oral pill, but I'm not open to having IV chemo. So that can help filter out further. And then age group, adult, pediatric. This might not always work reliably, but I wanted to just point it out in case. So some more specifics on what trials can consist of in terms of common inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is just a very general list, but I do feel as though these are typically common in what I've heard when I'm interacting with patients and when I've even, done clinical trials in the past at other roles. So they are really looking for a confirmed diagnosis through typically pathology reports or something official that really labels what exactly is going on. And I have found that I feel as though it's pretty black and white. It won't work if it's kind of just a physician's note or, kind of a rule out or anything like that. They really want to be completely certain that you have the diagnosis that they're indicating on their requirements. Performance status is another huge one as well. I have an example of the performance status scale here, and it really outlines, kind of going through the different categories of how you or a loved one might be feeling, or in terms of independence or assistance. And they oftentimes use this scale to just see, do we feel as though the side effects or, the treatment timeline that we have, or, how much involvement there is, will be appropriate for each patient. And I think this can be important in terms of, helping either rule out clinical trials or even, have more options as well. But this is important to know beforehand. I would say it's pretty common from what we see. And oftentimes they will say that they want the performance status scale to be from 60 to 70. And, I know there can be some discrepancies where maybe someone saw their healthcare provider and that week they were having a rough week. So their score ended up being a little bit lower than what they are now. So I really want to highlight that, you can definitely advocate to have that change on your record if you feel as though it's not reflective. You definitely deserve to have accuracy in your medical records, especially when it's something as sensitive as ruling you out for a clinical trial or not. They often also look at prior or concurrent treatments or protocols. There can often be specific guidelines on timing. So, did you have radiation an X amount of weeks ago, or, chemo, or the steroid usage and timing? Is there a certain gap between the last time you took steroids? How far out are you from it? Will you be on it, let's say, once you're screened and ready to go? Molecular markers can be a factor, adequate organ function. So oftentimes, some of these clinical trials, they might anticipate you might have a certain side effect, let's say with your platelets, or, something like that. And they really want to be able to know, are you going to be able to tolerate the treatment? Or also, is this coming from the treatment, or is it coming from a prior past medical history? So again, to help rule out sort of that bias as well. Recovery from prior treatments, which is similar to what we had talked about with the prior treatments as well. But, they want to make sure, are you having or experiencing symptoms from a past treatment? Or again, is this from the current treatment? And, when there's like lab work involved and just that daily monitoring, we really want to be very specific on knowing, if your dose needs to be held, or, it needs to be reduced. Is it from something that you've had in the past, or is it happening from the medication that you're taking right now? Prior exposure to the same class of drug, if that's relevant. Oftentimes, some medications can have a sort of window of time that you're allowed to take it, or a lifetime dosing or cumulative dosing. That's very common in certain medications. So they really want to make sure that, there's no further toxicities of you joining. Leptomeningeal disease, active bleeding, and participation in another active treatment trial. So again, the rationale for this would be to again compare and see, are you having symptoms from this trial or another trial? And, they're very specific on that, definitely on being specific about not being able to be on another trial, especially if it's a clinical trial that's from, let's say, an institution. So to further go into more specifics, a very common question we get a lot is, what can I do when I'm newly diagnosed or I'm at a recurrence? So unfortunately, trials are typically grouped based on disease stage. Most commonly, they can be in the newly diagnosed category and the recurrent categories. And, unfortunately, patients can have a limited number of chances to join trials, and enrollment can be so specific to timing, for disease onset, for progression. And, this is also why I just feel very passionate about being able to help patients and really advocate for them for, what are their options and what can they do? Because I think navigating this and, getting all this information, it can, again, just be so overwhelming. And to be told that you might not have an option that matches your, current state within your treatment timeline or within your disease process, it can be discouraging. So oftentimes, some of the trials will also have reoccurrence eligibility as well. So it might depend on the number of reoccurrences. They might say, you can only qualify if you've only had one reoccurrence, but now you're at the second reoccurrence, or, whatever the case may be. And I feel as though, again, that can be just so discouraging. And this is where I want to offer some hope, hopefully for some patients where, there can be expanded access programs available, off-label treatments, and emerging therapies available as well. And with expanded access programs, I really want to highlight that, you can contact like the drug manufacturer directly, or your physician can help guide you with that as well. And oftentimes, the reason that that expanded access program is there is because many people might just not qualify, in the traditional route of a clinical trial, where oftentimes these trials are very black and white with their specifics and, who can be eligible for that. And I think, sometimes the expanded access programs information might just not be out there. And, I would hate for someone to not get a resource or an option because sometimes a lot of this information comes up with, you don't know what you don't know. And in terms of long-term survivors or stable survivors who don't meet the criteria for either newly diagnosed or the standard recurrent categories, limited trial options can exist for them as well. However, there is potential to participate in observational registries, imaging, and quality of life studies. And I also just want to note, clinical trials, there's just so much different involvement in it. And I think from a patient's perspective and from a nursing perspective, it is something that is truly selfless, because, there's many unknowns. You can feel like there's a lot of things out of your control, but to be able to give back to science in that way and just hope with the hope of, helping someone in the future who, might be in your shoes right now is just very selfless. And, I really admire seeing what my patients go through and just, the vulnerability and, how much time and effort and capacity it really takes to go through all of this. So for some practical considerations, there's a lot involved, like I mentioned, and it can definitely be overwhelming. So I really wanted to share all of these considerations. So when we're talking about costs and funding, it's really important to know, what is covered, what is out of pocket, what is the sponsor's role in the clinical trial in trying to guide you through that cost. Is there anything that's involved with insurance? I know navigating health insurance and navigating healthcare, there can be just so many different loopholes. There can be so much that just there's the unknown about. Then there's, in network, out of network. It can definitely get to be a lot. And so it's very important to try to, see if you can get as much information as you can upfront about that. And again, it is completely your right to know all of this. You are the one that's going to be involved in all this in the day to day, and you just deserve to have all that information upfront if possible. And there can be questions about discounted lodging or travel accommodations or any stipends or reimbursement. It's also necessary to know in terms of like the time and travel, there might just be so many different frequency and lengths of visits. So you want to be able to ask, are you going to be covered for literally only if you go in for the treatment? And then let's say you have a side effect that causes you to maybe further get, more care. Let's say like an urgent care visit or an ER visit. Is that considered covered at all or assisted at all because it's related to let's say the medication you're taking? Or, does that come out of your own pocket completely? And it really can vary from site to site, from each study. So I don't want to give any specifics except for I really would just love to share this education piece on, it's completely your right to ask all of these details and just know as much as you can up front. Because, the last thing I would want any patient to go through, which can oftentimes happen, is, worrying about the cost when you're already worrying about so much else. And if you need any local accommodations, if that can be assisted at all with as well. And in terms of time and travel and practical considerations, you want to know, how often do I have to come in? Do I need to receive this drug, weekly, daily, monthly? What is the maintenance on this? Does, even if I come in and receive this, let's say my stock of pills for this week or this month, does that mean I can come in next month, or do I have to come in between for some kind of lab work or, reporting my symptoms? You need to see me in person. Can it be virtual? How many physician appointments are you really expecting? And, even though the phase 1 trials, there's a lot that, can be in the unknown. You can also ask, what have you been kind of seeing, or has the protocol been with other patients in this cohort? So, even if they're not able to give you more specifics on, let's say, what are the long-term effects or side effects, if you've already had this patient cohort for maybe a month or so, what has their lab work looked like? What are some common things that you've noticed that, patients are, complaining about or experiencing, so that, I can kind of get a heads up. And if there's anything that I want everyone to take away from tonight's webinar, is that informed consent is such a huge thing in the clinical trial world and just in anything in general. But there are strict guidelines for clinical trials for informed consent. So patients can choose to leave a trial at any time for any reason without it affecting their standard care or, their relationships with their healthcare team, their healthcare providers. Clinical trials are completely voluntary. And it's disheartening to hear sometimes of patients mentioning, I know that it's voluntary, but I just don't feel comfortable maybe leaving, even though I don't want to be on the trial. And, it's really on healthcare providers and people who are taking care of patients on a daily basis to, remind them, this is up to you. This is for, your own quality of life. It's based off of your own needs. It's based off of what's comfortable for you. And, at the end of the day, none of us are in those shoes. When I'm a nurse taking care of someone in a phase 1 trial, I'm not the one that's receiving the drug or has the diagnosis. It's really important to be able to empower you and others to just know this is voluntary, and you have every right to feel uncomfortable and not want to be not want to proceed. And this doesn't have to be something negative. You're allowed to just change your mind. And I know oftentimes, just in life, even in general, we can feel as though, I've committed a certain amount of time to something. Should I leave or should I stay? I gave my dedication to this, but again, it's really up to you. And, your healthcare providers should really be supportive of that as well. And yeah, I just really, really wanted to highlight that. And that goes hand in hand with the support that you can receive. It can be different at every healthcare institution. I'm well aware there's so many different resources at different institutions, and there's also a lack of resources at many institutions. And, there's so many layers behind that. But typically, I would hope that you would have a clinical research coordinator or someone helping manage that care with you. There can be nurses, nurse navigators, social workers, travel coordinators, your local and home physician team. And, everyone really should be hopefully providing you psychological and emotional support, which you really, really deserve. And in terms of the local and home physician team, another thing that I do want to highlight as well, when you're considering time, travel, and all these considerations, you have to also think about, if you're let's say you're, in one city and then you're going home, how is your home or local, let's say, physician team or healthcare provider team, or let's say the ER or urgent cares near you, how well are they equipped also to be able to, listen to you or have that feedback or communication with your healthcare team? I know this can be like very in an ideal situation where everyone is communicating at the same time, but I'm well aware a lot of our healthcare systems can be overburdened and there can just be limited capacity. However, they might just need to really know about, what treatment you're on because let's say you're in for something else at urgent care. It's really important for them to know what trial you're on because if they need to give you another medication, for whatever symptom you're coming in with, it's important to know, does that have an interaction or, with the trial that you're on? Or does it really impact anything that's going on? And a lot of times clinical trials do have, extensive protocols where they really have to be specific in what they're following. Even if it's something as simple as a headache, if they know that this drug might affect your liver enzymes and you have like a simple headache. I don't want to say simple because I don't want to downplay headaches. They can be really bad for sure. But if you just want to take some Tylenol for that, there can be just limitations on that. So it's very important to just know about all of that and keep your healthcare in the loop as well. Of course, our hope is that healthcare teams and healthcare providers would know off the bat, but again, I know there's so many differences in medical record systems. If you're in one state versus another state, if the institutions are not linked, if your portals are not linked, a lot can go missing. So I really advocate for us at the end of the day to really know about these kind of intricacies involved. So access and patient considerations. I think that a common misconception that I've heard is, do I only need to be referred to a clinical trial? And the answer is no. You can contact the clinical trial sites either directly by phone or email. You're not required to have a referral, although a referral from your oncologist can really help streamline the process, but it's not required. But of course, it can be incredibly helpful to kind of have that a foot in the door already if you're already, at the institution, you already have established care there, of course, it can be more smooth than coming in from, let's say, so to speak, out of network. And in terms of eligibility criteria, when you're contacting them directly, or even if you're being referred through your oncologist, it's important to know about any wait lists or site opening dates. So let's say there is a trial that you see and, online it shows as not, it's not recruiting. That might just not be accurate. The most accurate way to find out information would be by contacting these sites directly. Or, if your oncologist has that information offhand as well for you to reference. But yeah, there might be wait lists online when you're looking in a public facing way, and no one truly has further access to that besides, maybe uh, people on the research team, your healthcare providers, or the institution themselves. And this goes to saying with what we were mentioning before about, your treatment arm, perhaps knowing a little bit more detail. I know you might not be able to get more information on that aspect, but again, anything that's better to know with detail would be great. And dosing is another question that you could possibly ask too. Are you one of the first ones in this process with the lower dose, or am I one of the patients with the higher dose or later in the process? And this goes similar to what we were talking about before as well. And if you are seeking care currently at an institution, but they're just saying it doesn't seem like we're going to have much trials in the future, or maybe our hospital isn't big on clinical trials. Of course, it's an access issue, it's funding, there's so much involved. You can even try to establish care at an institution that might match your needs currently or in the future. And again, this is all about accessibility as well. And I totally acknowledge that, there's privilege in this. Some patients just might not be able to get a second opinion or establish care somewhere else when they're already physically at a different institution. So I know that that was a lot of information, and that's where we can come in to really help and, kind of organize everything that we were mentioning and really have that goal of not making you feel like you're alone in any of this. In terms of the BCSSA and Cancer Commons, I really want to highlight, how our team can help you navigate your care and a little bit of what we can provide. So we can provide insight into existing clinical evidence relevant to your case. That can mean anywhere from guidance on potential side effects, evidence-based outcomes, safety considerations, again, very specific to your own case, helping evaluating practical factors like we mentioned, time commitment, travel, eligibility, clarification of trials that might already be offered to you. So again, maybe you have 3 trials at hand that you felt are very good options for you, but you're just not sure, is there a potentially higher efficacy in one trial versus the other? Do I feel as though one trial is more tailored to me or, any specific mutations that I might have? So we can really help in that way as well. And, how does that fit your goals? There's also personalized collaboration between a Cancer Commons scientist team and the Brain Cancer Support and Solutions Alliance Nurse Navigator. And, again, more support in interpreting trial criteria, addressing your own needs, guiding you through any conversations that you might need with your medical team. Our goal is really for you to be able to collaborate with your healthcare team, not to be a replacement, but really try to work hand in hand together and, see where can we get better coordination for the next best steps for your priorities, for your preferences, and really offer that personalized care for you. And I just wanted to include our link here, and more information can be found on the website as well. So when do we help? We honestly can help you at any stage. Like I mentioned, if there's too many trials and you need to narrow something down, if maybe there's only a few clinical trial options left and you're looking for, just more trials that you haven't come across, or something that's maybe not in your city that you need us to help look in a different radius. We can also help if you're stable and you're aiming to prevent recurrence. So that can mean, identifying just more of your molecular testing results. If there's something in the mutations that shows up that maybe someone hadn't caught earlier, that can kind of match you to something down the line, we can make you aware of that. We can also help patients identify trials alongside adjuvant therapy options. If there's something that you can take concurrently with standard of care, expanded access programs. So again, just really helping advocate for, you can go through your provider on, is this trial available first off, and then can I be eligible? But if I'm not, is there any way we can contact the manufacturer or have another option to really just dive into that? Like we mentioned, because the clinical trial options can be really black and white with their criteria. Second opinion resources. So, we really advocate for just having another set of eyes, really look at your case, beyond just us. But it's just important, there might just be a specialist somewhere who really had seen your case, or, they had more information to give you. And, I think a lot of the times, the more eyes there are on a case, we can just have more insight. And I'm just a huge fan of second opinions, just for anything. And I think, I've also heard a lot of patients mention, maybe we're not comfortable with having a second opinion, or it's a bit challenging to, go through my physician for this. And just similar to what we mentioned about the clinical trials, it is completely your right to have a second opinion. And, if you're able to, you can directly make any appointments with other healthcare providers to have a second opinion. And, this is not meant to put anyone down at all. It is just to have more insight, more information, and, just have more advocacy for your care, which you completely deserve, and it's your right. And, I do recognize with second opinion resources, It really can depend on your insurance. Some insurances are more strict than others. There are some out-of-pocket virtual resources that we can share as well for second opinions. But again, those are out of pocket. So I recognize that it can be different accessibility-wise for different patients and molecular testing recommendations. So, oftentimes some patients might come to us and, maybe they have a rare tumor mutation or a marker that, they didn't know about. So, that's something that maybe we might have seen with many other different patients, or, maybe we can recommend having further testing done because the more specific we can get, the more tailored approach we can get for your treatment. So to further expand on the treatment options and guidance from us, our team of scientists also use a curated internal library of treatment options. This can include clinical trials, expanded access programs, off-label use, and repurposed medicine. This is built from publicly available resources such as clinicaltrials.gov and published literature. We really aim to have an evidence-based approach while also still thinking outside of the box. And this library can help match patient-specific features to treatment opportunities, integrating available data to support informed decisions. And, it's very exciting. And we're also in the process of developing and evaluating AI-based tools to help navigate more options and, just have more efficiency and provide greater clarity for treatment options. And unfortunately, we don't contact trial sites directly or physicians directly on behalf of patients. But we really want to provide that advocacy for patients in order to know any key questions to ask, strategies to reach out effectively, and just, even knowing that you are able to do that, and you don't have to wait on, that referral process or something else. We really want to make it as obstacle-free as possible. So, when you're able to work with us and collaborate with us, we really aim to use multiple tools, including the curated library, and, really again to help identify potential treatments to really empower you to take the next steps with more confidence and ease. Really want to highlight also that awareness now is very, very key. So brain tumor research, it's moving quickly. I know oftentimes it's not moving as quickly as we would like, but there have been many, many advancements and just so much information out there. And it's just really important to try to remain aware and, have access to that information. If possible, I have recommended for patients to seek primary oncology care at an NCI designated cancer center, which is the National Cancer Institute. But as you can see from this map, it's limited in locations, right? So this is where, the access and limitations come in. And, while it's great to recommend this, I understand that it might not be a reality for a lot of patients. And the reason that we do recommend this is because they will have a high volume of patients. They might have access to, cutting edge treatments, different scientific protocols, and things that are really not, out yet in every single hospital, which again is very unfortunate because as you can see, a lot of these locations are, they're not necessarily everywhere and accessible. It's very important to stay on top of new trials or expanded access or, just early data that's evolving month to month, which again, I know can be so overwhelming because when you're already navigating your care, the last thing you might have capacity to do is go and read a research article, especially if you don't have a clinical background. I mean, even with the clinical background, it can be a lot to take in and understand. So we really want to be supportive in that way. And, also again, like reaffirm that advocacy from your end on, working with your healthcare providers to help you provide more information. And like I mentioned earlier about the virtual second opinions. So, if you don't have access to, let's say, an NCI designated cancer center, perhaps you would even be able to engage with some virtual second opinions with neuro-oncologists. And if you kind of can or keep your records and things like that organized. A lot of these second opinion places might just ask you for specific things. So that might be helpful as well to keep on hand as a reference. So, every time if you're going to a different hospital or a different location, you don't have to kind of gather everything all over again. And you can kind of keep some of those key documents, whether it be, imaging impressions, physician notes, any other collaborative team care notes, or genetic reports and any like molecular profiling or anything like that. And we already talked about establishing care at these major centers. It's really what can improve access to trials. And, even trying to keep a list of accessible brain tumor centers near you can be helpful. It can just take away from one step of, now I have to go look what's near my radius, or, even thinking about, if it came to the point where I wanted to seek care somewhere else, what is the furthest distance I'm willing to go? What is the furthest distance that I am able to go, whether it be physically, financially, or just, timing wise? I know it's just there's a lot of barriers to this as well. And I also just wanted to include some questions to ask your healthcare team again for that further advocacy, for self-advocacy. Can we review my treatment timeline? What can we expect moving forward? Are there any clinical trials or experimental options that I should be aware of for the future? Would it be beneficial to get a second opinion at this stage? Is my tumor being monitored for any molecular changes that could open up new treatment paths? How can I best prepare now in case I need to act quickly later on? And, what symptoms or changes should I report right away that might signal reoccurrence? So, whether that can be anything like differences in coordination or motor skills or headaches, seizures, it's really important to be aware of, any of these changes and being able to escalate that care appropriately and not waiting too long before reporting those symptoms. And are there any upcoming trials I should be aware of? And are there any expanded access options that would be relevant to my case? Because again, sometimes it's just we don't know what we don't know. And oftentimes some of these questions might just not come up naturally when there's so much going on and so many moving parts within your healthcare appointment, which, oftentimes it can be short, it can be quick, or it can be virtual. And you might just not get to everything at once if there's another pressing issue at the appointment. And, lastly, I really just wanted to acknowledge the barriers that we've talked about before. Socioeconomic factors, equity, and privilege can really influence access to care. And, I don't want to be blind to that when I'm sharing all this information. Like I said, many patients do not have equal access to major centers, advanced testing, or trials. A lot of this is just simply very out of reach for, honestly, the reality of a lot of patients. And so our goal is really to empower all patients and reduce barriers through support, guidance, and awareness. We really aim to provide any additional resources as well, such as sharing travel and lodging assistance programs, access to resources for financial assistance, highlighting those virtual second opinions or any telemedicine options, really helping understand and accessing, any compassionate use expanded access programs, guidance on how to approach the trial sites and communication with providers, further resources on psychological, emotional resources, caregiver support, any additional education on tumor biology or testing, really to help support that informed decision making. And again, just education on organizing those medical records that we talked about before, questions for providers, and treatment timelines with evidence-based research. And as I mentioned before, here are the links from the QR codes that I had provided. And so you can have this as a reference to go to if you need any resources. I've also included some more information and support resources from Brains for the Cure, which is part of the Head for the Cure, and from the Musella Foundation, the Brain Tumor News Blast. You can really receive a lot of new and upcoming information on any brain tumor news and oftentimes it can be hard to have that information if you're just doing kind of a general search. So it's great to just have that as a resource. And it's just really incredible, what comes out of these resources and how many people are truly willing to help and just not help, not make patients feel isolated. And, there's a lot out there. So I just wanted to say, thank you so much again for joining us today. And of course, if there's any questions, I would love to answer to the best of my ability. But if not, we'll definitely get back to you. And yeah, I just thank you again for having me.
Don't go anywhere, Unsha. We have lots of great questions. And they're coming in multiple locations. We have them in the chat and the Q&A, and I have a few offline also. So bear with me as I go through them, but I'll try to get through them quickly because we're coming up on the hour. But most importantly, are your services free?
Yes, yes, they are. They're free. And yeah, I'm just really glad to be able to share that again because we had talked about access and privilege and just, equity and really just really lucky to say that it's free when we help support and provide that individual care.
Okay, and it was sort of on that last slide there, but someone asked, how can someone connect with Unsha further on resources?
Oh, yes. So in that last slide that we provided, there was a link where you can register and sign up, and we will be providing a recording, and that will include the slides as well.
Okay, yeah, and someone just asked if we're going to share the slides. We typically don't make the slides available, but we do make the recording available. And if you go to the Q&A, the website where you can find that is listed. And of course, you can just scroll through to the end of the presentation to get the link. Um, Let's see. I did want to comment. Someone had asked, how do you interact with the doctors running the clinical trials? And you mentioned that the navigation program, the navigators don't reach out on behalf of the patient individually, but I did just want to clarify that I know sometimes our navigators will reach out with general questions. If there's something in the inclusion exclusion criteria on clinicaltrials.gov and it's unclear and that the answer would help, more than just one patient, sometimes we'll reach out in that way. And also all three of the collaborative nonprofits from the BCSSA, the Musella Foundation, Head for the Cure, and Cancer Commons all do very proactively um, advocate for patients, for the doctors running clinical trials. So a lot of that comes in the form of trial design. So, when they're coming up with who they're going to let into trials and, what the requirements are going to be, we are huge advocates for the patient voice in that context. Okay, another question. So my daughter was told of clinical trials way too late. How do nurse navigators interact with neuro-oncologists to make sure that they're aware of your service so that patients are getting your resources, when they're really needed?
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry to hear that that happened, and I think that again, it's about, having that awareness and education and access to that. And, it's unfortunate that sometimes timing doesn't work out in those ways. And in terms of nurse navigation and speaking with providers, in terms of me personally, because I'm not at the clinical trial sites or directly working with physicians, it's a little harder for me to have that information up front. But we really want to advocate for that support from your team. So, again, if you feel as though maybe a provider isn't being as proactive as you feel, those second opinions can really come in to be really important in those time frames. And, you really deserve to have someone who takes your case as, urgently as you feel it, as though it's appropriate as well. Having that kind of, being on the same page is really, really important from what I share with my patients as well.
Okay, and also my first interaction with nurse navigators was with my DIPG navigator, and I had no idea there are multiple types of nurse navigators. I'm wondering if you all collaborate. For example, for a parent of a DIPG child, if they contact your Navigator program, do you send them to my DIPG Navigator? Just wondering how and if you all communicate with one another.
Yes, so we have sent patients to other navigators before. Oftentimes we don't have that direct communication in terms of, let's say, a daily communication or anything like that, but I'm very happy to help advocate and, make any connections or, just make anything easier for a patient if that helps guide your care or, anything personalized in terms of contacting or just looking out for more information. And again, Vanessa, like what you mentioned before, a lot of what we do can really just help so many patients. So it's really important for us to have that information and access to communicating with each other.
And I did want to highlight this too. A huge value of the navigation programs is not only, the awareness of everything on clinicaltrials.gov and in the published literature, but also it's a patient learning health system. So every patient benefits from the experience of all the other patients that have gone through the navigation system. Whereas your neuro-oncologist may only be seeing patients in that local area, the BCSSA is seeing brain tumor patients from all across the country and all across the world and sharing that knowledge, sort of all across the learning health system. Okay, do all clinical trials have control groups?
It really varies. So I don't want to give the wrong answer, but it really varies trial to trial. And it would really be necessary to see what their criteria is when signing up. But I want to say that not every single trial has a control group. But yeah, I just don't want to give the wrong answer for sure.
And I'll help out there. A lot of the earlier phase trials don't have control groups because you're just testing safety. You're not comparing it to anything yet. Once you get into, especially the phase threes, often there is a control group. But on the nonprofit side, when it comes to things like GBM and DIPG, we really hate to see those control groups, especially if it's blinded and you don't know what group you're in. So there's a lot of conversations and patient advocacy on the ethics of that and, whether or not we could be using registries for comparison or whether we can be using synthetic control groups versus just giving people placebo pills. Um, okay. When I ask about clinical trials, when I'm asking my neuro-oncologist at Duke and UNC, I get told I don't qualify, but I'm not given a reason why. Suggestions?
I'm really sorry that you're not given a reason why, because, if you're being ruled out for something, you definitely deserve to hear the reasoning and the rationale. Maybe you actually don't qualify, of course, but again, it's your right to really know why. And I think that information can also, move you further because then it can help you narrow down maybe other trials that you might qualify for, but you might be able to look into, okay, this criteria doesn't match me, but what other criteria can match in terms of perhaps advice on, how to communicate that, you know, I would ask, I understand, like, thank you for sharing that, but would you be able to just tell me why I don't qualify so that I can just have it for my own knowledge and, as my own reference, because I really want to advocate for the best care that I can get for myself. And, if this is even helpful for other family members or patients, in the future as well.
Great. Any advice on how to navigate personalized N of 1 treatments, particularly combination therapies involving two or more treatments?
I think that is a common question from different patients because oftentimes we can see treatment and just, sometimes the results might not have worked for someone, but it can work for one individual person, especially when we're looking at so many combination treatments. And I think that's where, we can help too with, if you would like to sign up and kind of have that personalized approach and just have us see and look into really what your treatment plan has been and, what your history has been.
And also, I'll chime in just to say from the learning system, you all really have your ear to the ground on, if someone wants to try that combination treatment, you may know of somebody else getting it across the country and a neuro-oncologist that would be willing to work with the patient on that combination and et cetera. Okay, moving into the chat questions. Um, let's see. Okay. You sort of touched on this, but if I'm eligible for three child trials, how do I pick which one? Can you help?
Yes, so we would be able to help with that. And again, it's really being able to, look at what trials were offered to you, looking through that criteria and kind of matching it to, what is going on with your treatment plan, with your history, with your markers, and seeing what matches there. And, again, all the practical considerations that we talked about as well, like what are you looking for, kind of helping narrow down maybe time, cost, commitment, and, quality of life factors and based off of your needs.
Okay, and also, you talked about seeking a second opinion or trial options, but specifically, how would you word that for someone who's newly diagnosed? You know, a lot of people are intimidated by that. They feel uncomfortable asking for that. So how would you go about that?
I completely understand feeling uncomfortable. And in terms of going about that, I think just going in with really remembering, this is for your own care, this is for your advocacy, and as intimidating as it can be, it's really truly your right. And, it doesn't have to be something that is, let's say, aggressively asked or anything like that. I would frame it as very assertive. It's being very educated on your own treatment and, how you can move forward. And I think having that comfort level as well with your provider who is comfortable to say, of course, I encourage a second opinion. Maybe like, let me see what we can work together with or what you heard about. I know that doesn't ideally always happen, but I would say, just to really remember that this is for your own, your present, your future, it's for your loved ones, and it's really for you, and it's your right to really just ask any questions that you want. And don't let anyone make you feel as though you're asking too many questions or you're being too much. I just think there's no such thing. I think it's just so great to be able to advocate for yourself. And I really just wish everyone, was able to do that comfortably.
Okay, next question. I am from outside the USA. Can I participate in a US trial?
Yes, so it would depend on if you are able to, again, establish care at that specific institution. In it would depend on, I guess, like the process of that. But there isn't a specific limitation on, if you're not from here, you can't enroll. And oftentimes we have a lot of patients who are also looking at international trials as well.
Okay. You mentioned expanded access and right to try. What are those?
Yes. So with expanded access programs, I'm going to try to not like butcher the description, but there's oftentimes just many different trials where, the criteria is just black and white, but it might be something that is helpful for the patient. And, it's a shame that maybe they can't enroll in the trial just because they don't match maybe one bullet point in the criteria. So it's a way for patients to have access to another medication or intervention while, going through either their physician or the manufacturer and kind of having that extra option, as a treatment option.
Okay. From Raphael, he asks, what if my oncologist is recommending a wait and see approach? Do I continue to search for a clinical trial in case I have a recurrence?
So a lot of patients come to us with this question as well. And I think that it's always great to be proactive. And, I do hear about a lot of healthcare providers, saying the quote unquote wait and see approach. But I think just framing it as, you're advocating for yourself and you're being really aware of all these emerging things that are up and coming. And I don't think it hurts at all to keep an eye out to, continue seeking other resources or support groups. I know there's even so many different, uh, you know, virtual threads or Facebook support groups where, different patients have talked about different outcomes or treatments that they've found through other providers. And, again, this is your own personal situation. And so if you don't feel comfortable with that approach, I completely understand because, you have the right to live and, be comfortable with your decisions and advocate for yourself. And, sometimes healthcare has not caught on to that concept.
Awesome. How accurate is the information on clinicaltrials.gov?
I would say that I've heard and I've seen myself that it can oftentimes not be accurate at all. So while it can serve as a blueprint of information that you can look into, it's really just important to contact the trial sites directly for the most up-to-date and accurate information, which unfortunately makes it so frustrating because, it's more legwork on a patient's behalf or a caregiver, but yeah, I would caution with knowing that it's not always 100% accurate at all.
And I know Al's on. Al, I don't know if you could come on just to answer a fun question, but how did patients find trials before there was a clinicaltrials.gov? I just love this story, so I wanted you to
Um,
tell.
that's a long story, but they didn't. In the old days, there was no centralized listing of clinical trials. The government only had a list of the trials that they were supporting, but there was a lot of other trials like initiated, uh, investigator-sponsored trials or drug company-sponsored trials. And we helped create the first version of clinicaltrials.gov. We had our first database that we populated using surveys of every hospital in the country. And National Institute of Health came to us and models clinicaltrials.gov for our website.
Yeah, I'm such a huge fan of Al, and that's just one of the many reasons why. Okay, we're getting over the hour. I just have a couple more questions for you, Unsha. We sort of touched on this, but just to make it very explicit, if I enter a clinical trial, do I have to transfer my care there? Like, do I have to switch my neuro-oncologist from my local to the one at the trial site?
I'm trying to think back at when I was working in the hospitals. Honestly, I'm not sure of that question. Vanessa, would you have more insight on
Yeah,
that? Okay.
yeah, I absolutely will because we did this personally. I'm a GBM caregiver. My husband did a clinical trial not at, his original center, and we maintained care at our original center while also working with the trial site. So, again, we empower you to be the advocate for yourself. If you want to keep care at both sites, it might mean more doctor visits, but you can do that. Let's see, next. On that note, I also wanted to say too, a lot of times when people talk about should I get a second opinion, where should I go for the second opinion, and they're looking at the NCI designated, cancer centers, and they're looking at the centers of excellence. Another strategy too is to find the clinical trial or treatment that you are most interested in, and go wherever that is. If that's at one of the major centers, great, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's at a more obscure center, but that that's the right treatment that for you that you want. So that is also a strategy there. And another thing I thought was really important to bring up is, can clinical trials be suspended or terminated prior to conclusion of the study?
I believe that they can, just because there's so many different factors. It can be either maybe a safety issue, it can be a funding issue. There can be many different factors. So unfortunately, that can happen. And I know it's unfortunate when that happens because it can leave patients to scrambling for finding another option or other care.
Yeah, and that's the flip side of, patients feel this obligation once they're in a trial, they have to stay in a trial because they made this commitment. But, as Unsha says, you do what's best for you. On the flip side, a lot of these trials are funded by, you know, pharmaceutical companies, and they have priorities with their portfolio. And sometimes all of a sudden, this particular trial is not making their budget cuts above the line, and so they just decided to terminate the trial. So that does happen, and just take that into consideration when you're making your plans. And then finally, how will I be informed about the results of a clinical trial I participate in? What happens when it ends?
I'm not certain about that. However, I know it depends on the timeline of the study and I guess like when they're actually working on publishing those results and how they become accessible. But my hope is that maybe someone at your clinical trial site can also give more insight into that, or maybe whoever the principal investigator is of the study as well can have more insight, or the clinical trial coordinators.
Absolutely. And there is a requirement and obligation for the investigators to post the results on clinicaltrials.gov. The timing of that, sometimes they're not posted in a timely fashion, but theoretically they should be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. And then if there's a publication that comes out of that, you can follow up with the clinical trial coordinator, the investigator, to ask, what the time frame is for that. I think that's all of our questions. So in closing, I just want to thank you, Unsha, for presenting today and for all the amazing work that you do with the BCSSA. I also want to give a really heartfelt thank you to everyone at Cancer Commons and Head for the Cure and Al Musella and the Musella Foundation for coming together to fund the BCSSA. It's just such an amazing service. And to our live audience, like we said, the webinar has been recorded and will be made available shortly at virtualtrials.org. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very nice. We'll see. Could you talk about the next?
Oh, yeah, actually, before, thank you, Al, for reminding me of that. We have several other webinars coming up throughout the month of May. We actually have one tomorrow with Dr. John Bookfire from Lenox Hill. That's on new strategies to bypass the blood-brain barrier to improve the delivery of chemotherapeutics for brain tumors. We have one on Thursday, May 15th with Dr. Leland Hu on fractional tumor burden mapping. We have one on Sunday, May 18th with Dr. Bert Neighbors titled Glioblastoma Beyond the Guidelines. And we'll have one on Thursday, May 29th with Dr. Nick Vitanza on the advancement of B7H3 targeting CAR T cells against pediatric brain and spinal cord tumors. I hope to see you all on those webinars as well. Thank you.